All right, so this project is essentially a regional plan that we did that focuses on the Hudson River Estuary watershed in New York. That's the area between the very bottom of Manhattan and eastern parts of Brooklyn and Staten Island, all the way up to Troy and Albany, New York. And through this project, we identified 95 native pollinator species that are at risk of local extinction from the Hudson River estuary watershed area, and the plants that those species need in order to survive and thrive, and then created a series of replicable landscape designs for 4 different properties in the watershed that are meant to be used by the community and by the public for replication on their own sites. So I usually start off with a bit of background. I know I'm talking to members of the choir here, so I'll skip this section. I'll go through this pretty quickly, but essentially we're living in the age of the Anthropocene. We are facing the global mass extinction of species, as well as many other impacts that you are all well aware of. And currently, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet are heading toward extinction. What this essentially means is a potential collapse of nature, with over 25% of the native bee species in North America threatened with extinction, as well as 1 million species globally. As you probably know, insects are essential for all ecosystems, not only as pollinators, but as food for other creatures and recyclers of nutrients. The main reason for the decline of these species is loss of habitat, which essentially translates to loss of natural undisturbed spaces. In the words of one scientist, we are sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. Not just insects are being impacted, we're also seeing unprecedented bird declines. North America has lost 3 billion birds since 1970, which is over 1 in 4 birds. And again, habitat loss is the most direct cause. According to the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, there's 5 main threats to global biodiversity, and the top 2 are basically loss of habitat, followed by climate change. So what impacts pollinators? Impacts all terrestrial ecosystems, and it largely impacts biodiversity globally. But in order to solve the biodiversity crisis, we have to solve the climate crisis, or you could say the same thing about the climate crisis. Biodiversity loss is not a result of climate change, but rather it's part of the solution, because connected, diverse, and extensive ecosystems actually help stabilize the climate, and they have a better chance of thriving in a world permanently altered by rising emissions. So we want to have biodiversity, not only because it's wonderful and beautiful, but because it helps us respond better to climate change. Just looking at grasslands specifically, grasslands are largely considered to be open landscapes that are not forested. They can contain grasses dominant, or it can be a mix of grasses and flowering species. 20% of the global carbon stocks and 1/3 of the world's land-based carbon is held by grasslands. And a 2019 study found that expanding cropland in the US put as much carbon dioxide in the air as 31 million cars. Another study from the year before found that by conserving grasslands in the US, we could prevent almost 3 times as many carbon emissions as conserving forests. And that's because a lot of the carbon sequestration is underground in the really deep root systems of our native grasses and flowers. And while 20% of the Amazon has been destroyed, half of all temperate grasslands have been destroyed. So there are more of a declining system, and sandplain grasslands specifically, which we find in Massachusetts only on the coast, are one of the world's most endangered habitats. So looking at carbon sequestration, of note is that soil contains almost twice as much carbon in the atmosphere as all living flora and animals combined. So there's actually more carbon being held underground, which is contrary to what a lot of people think. They think that we have to plant trees to sequester carbon, but in fact, wetlands hold the most carbon, with 643 gigatons being held in the soil. and temperate grasslands hold more carbon total when you combine soil and biomass than forests in temperate environments. So we really need to consider our grasslands in Massachusetts as a key ally in responding to climate change, not just putting forests everywhere. In a climate change scenario where there's a lot of potential impacts from wildfires, even in places like New England, the difference between a wildfire moving through a forest and an open field or grassland is that the carbon in the forest is released into the atmosphere predominantly when the trees burn. And that's because they hold most of their carbon in the biomass above the ground, in the leaves and in the branches and in the trunks. However, when a grassland burns, most of the carbon remains stored and locked into the root system of those plants. And this is just one example of that. This is native Indian grass, which has a 12-foot deep root system. So in environments or landscapes where forest fires are a potential present or future climate impact, I think it's really important to consider converting or stewarding those landscapes as open grasslands rather than just planting more trees. This is the difference between what happens when a fire moves through a forest where fire has been suppressed and an ecologically managed forest where there's space between the trees and there's a diversity of vegetation, a diversity of heights and types of vegetation. You can see that on the right, the fire doesn't kill the canopied species. Some of you may be familiar with this diagram. It's showing the different root systems of typical grassland species. So on the left, we have Kentucky bluegrass, which is something that you'd find in your lawn. It's got a root depth of about 2 inches. Heath aster, which is one of our native asters, is over here with a root depth of about 8.5 feet. Then we have switchgrass and little blue stem. So you can see that the difference between the native and the non-native species is huge, not just in terms of whether it provides resources to pollinators or birds or other species, but also in terms of how much carbon and how much life it's promoting under the soil. But it's really not just about carbon. Biodiversity, as I mentioned, is really a key ally. And one study that I would just want to highlight, in Minnesota, they studied abandoned farmland over a 22-year period, and they had different plots of vegetation that they were testing soil carbon storage rates. During the first 12 years of the project, there was no difference, or really a negligible difference, in the soil carbon storage of any of the plots. And the plots went from a single non-native turfgrass species all the way up to 16 species of native warm season grasses and flowers. So that was considered the highest diversity treatment. They also had an 8-species treatment, a 4-species treatment, and a 2-species treatment. And what they found was, while the first 12 years, there was not much of a difference, somehow in the magical 13th year of this 22-year study, soil carbon storage rates were 200% greater in the highest plant diversity treatment, which had 16 native grassland species, compared to the one single species of a non-native grass. So at Landscape Interactions, which is basically a landscape planning and design studio where I work, which I started 5.5 years ago, we're really attempting to design nature in this age of the Anthropocene. So we look at everything from farmland to conservation properties, urban and suburban, open space, parks, campuses, rural communities, and even large-scale solar arrays as our best opportunities for expanding regional biodiversity and climate change resilience, as well as ecological health and food security. And we do that by really looking at the pollination scale. What is occurring at the first trophic level between native pollinators and the plants that they pollinate and the plants that they need? Because that essentially builds the entire food web that feeds everything from birds and small mammals all the way up to tertiary consumers like mountain lions, coyotes, bear, and also humans. What happens at the pollination scale has repercussions all the way through the food web. So why are pollinators important? As you probably know, they're primarily insects that fertilize plants, producing seeds and fruit. 80% of the world's flowering plants need pollinators for reproduction, and that includes a lot of tree species. In Massachusetts, 45% of our food crops depend on bees specifically, and a third of the global food supply depends on pollinators. And most habitats and ecosystems depend upon pollinators, either directly through the reproduction of the plants that they provide or through the food webs that they support. Some plants only are pollinated by a specific genus or species, and that's called a specialist relationship. And approximately 15% of northeastern native bee species are specialists in terms of the pollen they collect at the genus level. So what are the needs of a native bee? How can we look at our landscapes and try to make sure that they're serving the needs of a native bee? And the reason why we use a native bee as a proxy for this work is because of the distance that they fly from their nest and how that's a good representation of what other insects also are able to do. So there's about 4,000 native bee species in the US, and over 400 live in the Northeast. A really important study in 2013 found that 41 different food crops that were studied on every continent, 600 different field trials, wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit in all 41 of those food crops. The average distance that a native bee flies from its nest is only between 200 and 1,800 feet. So habitat connectivity is key, and 70% of native bee species in the Northeast nest underground. Most live alone, they don't have colonies, and examples of habitat include bare, exposed, well-draining earth, soft twigs, like things that you'll find on elderberry or Joe pyeweed, abandoned rodent burrows, and dead trees and snacks. This is from one of our design sites in New York State, which I'll be going into in a little bit, and just showing you the proximity of different pieces of habitat across a 200-acre landscape and the distance that different native bee species can fly from the center of each habitat location. So you can see that a sweat bee only goes as far as the pink dashed lines, whereas a mason bee would go as far as the blue and a bumblebee as far as the yellow. So really having lots of, relatively closely spaced pieces of habitat is really essential if you want to create a corridor and help species move from one location to the next. There's many other significant pollinators, not just bees. The ruby-throated hummingbird is one example. Because it's not a threatened species, we don't target it specifically for our work, but it benefits from the work that we're doing because a lot of the plants and the habitat requirements of a hummingbird are also met when designing for some of those at-risk bees or butterflies. The Aphrodite fritillary butterfly is a species of conservation concern in Massachusetts. It's at risk in New York, and it only lays its eggs on native violets. Monarch butterfly, as you know, it only lays its eggs on native milkweed. They're facing something like an 81% population decline globally. It sort of goes up and down each year. The southern pine sphinx moth is an example of a specialist on pine. They only lay their eggs on pine, and they prefer pitch pine. And they're at risk or critically imperiled or vulnerable in many different states, including New York, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, Delaware, and Indiana. And I would venture to say that they're probably a species of concern in Massachusetts as well. We just don't have the data. But looking at the other states that they're declining in, it's almost certain. A lot of people, first became aware of pollinator declines because of honeybees. And between 1980 and 2005, the number of honeybee colonies in the US declined by 50%. However, since 2005, beehive populations in the US have not only been increasing, but they've stabilized. So what this tells us is that honeybees are not at risk. They're not in danger of extinction. So therefore, one would surmise that we don't have to worry about them. We don't have to design landscapes for honeybees. However, looking at native bees and which are considered wild bees, just between a 5-year period, 2010 to 2015, looking at the lower 48 states, wild bee abundance went down 23%. So that's pretty alarming. The areas that have yellow in this map are the areas with the lowest wild bee abundance in that study. Now, looking at this next map, this is estimated agricultural use of just one type of neonicotinoid pesticide. So you can see here that these maps are nearly identical. What this tells us is that there's a direct correlation between abundance or lack of abundance of wild bees and use of neonicotinoid pesticides. As far as food crops go, bumblebees are arguably the most important crop pollinators. They pollinate all major food crops, and they're the only bees that pollinate tomatoes. But there's also lots of other native bee groups that are pollinating our food, including Andrena, mason bees, Lasioglossum, Halictus. Again, talking about honeybees, if you overcrowd a landscape with honeybees, you're actually pushing out other pollinators. And that's because they outcompete wild bees and other insects for pollen and nectar and other resources. And here's just a list of some peer-reviewed studies that have examined that. And the takeaway is that conserving honeybees does not help wildlife, and honeybees negatively affect abundance of everything from short and long-tongued bumblebees to solitary bees, hoverflies, march flies, other flies, and other flying insects. So raising honeybees to save the bees is like raising chickens to save the birds, essentially. What we're doing is really looking at species-level interactions between plants and pollinators. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, a lot of bees and plants have a more specialized relationship. They're not just generalists. This is just one example of that. It's a bottle gentian, and it's being pollinated by a medium-tongued bumblebee, which is Bombus vagans. And the reason why this video is so useful is because it illustrates that it's because of the large size of the bumblebee that they're able to force their way into the flower. This flower has a closed form. It doesn't allow any insect to enter it. So only bumblebees can force their way into the bottle gentian, and only long and medium-tongued bumblebees can reach the nectar reward at the base of the flower, which is where the pollen is stored. So essentially, this is an illustration of a specialized relationship. If you only had one species of bumblebee there, and they happen to be a short-tongued species like the common eastern bumblebee, this plant would not be getting pollinated, and eventually it would become sterile or extinct from that landscape. So seeing lots of bees does not necessarily mean that the landscape is pollinator friendly. It really matters how diverse the landscape is, how many different species there are, not only of bees, but of other insects and of plants. And that's the difference between diversity and abundance. So in Massachusetts, we've already lost 2 bumblebee species out of the 11 that are widely found across the state, and 2 other species are expected to be gone within the next decade. In New York State, they did a survey which was published in 2022. It's a statewide assessment of the conservation status of pollinators. And the Empire State Native Pollinator Survey found that 24% of native bee species in New York were at risk, 11% were extirpated, and between 38 and 60% of native bees, flies, beetles, and moths were either at risk or extirpated. And that also includes 25% of New York bumblebee species are already extirpated. So that's pretty big. And that's a really, really big concern. This is a map of the Hudson River Estuary watershed. This includes everything from large portions of New York City up to Albany and Troy. In the past 22 years, 62% of all bumblebee observations in the entire watershed area were a single species, which is represented by the light yellow dots. And here's a bar graph showing you that. So comparing historical observations of bumblebees in the Hudson River Estuary watershed, which is basically all recorded observations going back to 1877 all the way through 1999, we had a pretty even distribution of about 17 or 18 species that were present. In the past 22 years, from 2000 to 2021, which is when the data that we collected for this ended, in that 22-year period, 62% of all observations were Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee. So again, just seeing lots of bees doesn't necessarily mean that the landscape is healthy or that supporting pollinators. It might just be one species. We're also facing native plant community loss. 25% of New York and New England's native plant species have been lost in comparison to historical figures, and non-native plant species, including invasive species, have increased regionally nearly 20%. Just a little bit about native plants and cultivars of native plants, which are all otherwise known as nativars. it's really important to distinguish because a lot of papers have looked at this, and many papers suggest that wild bees and insects prefer to forage on the nectar of pollen from native plants compared to cultivars. And in many cases, horticulturally modifying native plants may negatively affect pollinators. It can also produce flowers that are sterile. And some cultivars of native species don't even have pollen. So we recommend just using straight native species. Birds are also closely aligned with native plant species presence. A study that was done in suburban Washington, D.C. by Doug Tallamy and Desiree Naranjo found that if suburban yards in the D.C. area had less than 70% native plants, they could not support a single nest of Carolina chickadees. So essentially, diversity is resilience. Having a diverse combination of plant species is going to then have, not essentially guarantee, but have a greater chance of having a more diverse population of animal species, including insects. And that is going to make that landscape more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Because if you can just imagine, whether it's flooding, wildfire, drought, invasive species pressure, rising carbon dioxide emissions, all of these climate change impacts are going to affect landscapes differently. But what they all have in common is that they all are forms of disturbance. And with disturbance, you don't want to have a landscape with just 1 or 2 or 3 or even 5 species on it. The more species you have on the landscape, whether it's an open field or whether it's a forest, the higher there is of a chance that that landscape will respond following that disturbance. We'll be able to bounce back following that disturbance. So looking at this project, Pollinate Now, as I mentioned, this is a bioregional strategy for the Hudson River Estuary watershed. So we looked at this entire watershed area and we considered it to be a bioregion, which is really a large landscape that has similar or related ecological and environmental features that are somehow unified, whether it's in terms of types of landscapes, human use of the landscapes, or a combination thereof. And it's really an identifiable region of interacting life systems. And in this case, you can see a really clear tie, even just looking at something as simple as food production. How many farms are located in the Hudson Valley or in Westchester County that are feeding New York City? And then the same could be said for New York City's water supply. Well, it comes from the Catskills and parts of the Adirondacks. Same thing goes for forest cover. The predominant forest cover of the metropolitan New York area is actually north of the city. It's in this Hudson River estuary watershed. So this is certainly a bioregion. And looking at this bioregion, it's a large area. There's millions of people living in it. It includes hundreds of cities and towns. So to sort of take away some of those barriers, we decided to focus for this first phase of the project on 4 sub-watersheds of the Hudson River estuary. So this is a map of these 4 sub-watersheds. They're all located in the Mid-Hudson region. And for each of these sub-watersheds, we selected a site where we could actually create a design and a landscape management plan that would then be implemented. And the idea is that each of these sites, we're calling them toolkit sites, they're models for the community and they can be replicated. So one of them was a farm site, one of them was a conservation site, one of them was an urban residential site, and one of them was a riparian property. And they're located here in these different sub-watersheds all along the Hudson River. Obviously, there's a lot of analysis that goes into this work. Here's just a few examples of some of the environmental and ecological analyses that we performed when doing these assessments. We also looked at pollinator observations in the watershed. As I mentioned, bumblebee diversity has declined precipitously. We also included all pollinator records in building this plant list and this pollinator list in these mapped areas. So all counties in New York State that are within the watershed, as well as neighboring counties. Now let's take a look at the toolkit sites and the plants that we're using on them. So this is our list of at-risk species for this project. These are all species of bees, butterflies, and moths that are known to be declining and at risk of local extinction in the Hudson River estuary watershed area. It's 95 species. It includes 49 native bees, 34 native butterfly, and 12 native flower visiting moth species, so specifically moths that pollinate. we have a pretty comprehensive plant list for the project. We dialed it down to about 150 plants, including everything from trees like maple down to really, really small woodland flowers and sedges, and pretty much everything in between. And in this comprehensive plant list, which is available as part of the Pollinating Now project on our website for free download, I'll give you guys the link. For each plant, we also list whether it's a pollen, a nectar, or a host plant, and whether it supports at-risk bumblebees, other at-risk bees, butterflies, or moths. So just a few examples of some of the specialized relationships that we're supporting. I'm going to move a little fast here, but you can see here, these are 3 of the at-risk butterflies, and they're all essentially host plant specialists. The Appalachian azure only lays its eggs on native black cohosh. The hackberry emperor, it will only lay its eggs on trees in the Celtis genus, which is basically hackberries and sugarberries. The Dion skipper, just native sedges and rushes. There's also some examples from some of the malts. And a lot of these malts tend to not be as specialized on their host plants, but somehow they're still declining. We don't know exactly if it's because of loss of host plant or loss of habitat. In a lot of cases, a lot of malts are habitat specialists. They might only inhabit certain types of forests or certain types of wetland environments. With the bees, a lot of the bees on our list are pollen specialist bees, but not all of them. But pollen specialist bees oftentimes tend to be at higher risk because they are only dependent on a small group of plants for reproduction. We also analyzed our complete plant list and sort of highlighted the top 18 plants that supported the most at-risk species. And those included native rubus, which is blackberries and raspberries, native willows, native plums and cherries, native goldenrod, meadowsweet, dogbane, blueberries and cranberries, etc. This is all available on the download. For each of these 4 toolkit sites, we actually surveyed them 4 times over the course of the 2022 growing season to see which bees and butterflies were on the sites and which plants they were visiting before we did any habitat changes, before we planted or seeded anything. And the reason for that is to capture baseline information of what was the quality of the habitat on the sites before we did anything. And we're going to compare that with the results of the sites after the habitat is installed and is well established and blooming, most likely starting next year or the year after. So looking at the riparian site, it's on the Wallkill River in Gardner, New York, which is on the border with New Paltz. And essentially, we created a replicable riparian buffer, so it can be repeated all along the riverbank. And the design repeats every 100 feet. So it's like sort of like a linear design. The entire property is within the 100-year floodplain. So you can see it has a lot of flooding impacts. And this design, what's nice about it is that breaking it out into these different zones, riverbank, understory, and full sun upland areas, you get such a wide range of plants and such a wide range of habitat that this alone would be enough to support pretty much all of the at-risk, 95 at-risk species on our list. And at the same time, supporting that riverbank, preventing the propensity of the riverbank to erode, and helping to slow and spread those floodwaters before they reach the house and the outbuildings on the property. This is a scaled section of what the riparian buffer would look like after it's established and growing in, fully grown in scale to 2 people walking alongside a mowed path. And you can see here different historic flood levels. This is based on a USGS flood gauge that's located 1 mile upstream from the site. So it's actually experienced quite a lot of flooding. And then for each of the toolkit sites, there's a habitat management timeline, including the site preparation timeline, the installation timeline, and the maintenance timeline. Our second site is an urban residential property. It was created for the YWCA in Kingston, New York. It's only 1/3 of an acre, but it actually had 12 different zones. And that's because it was just such a unique property with a mix of sun and shade, a mix of droughty areas and sort of, really full shade areas. So we did quite a number of different designs for that. including plants that are salt and drought tolerant, plants that are full shade tolerant, and what have you. As well as also a bee and like a lawn replacement that's consisting all of native sedges, grasses, and flowers. They're all tolerant of foot traffic and occasional mowing. So we call that the bee and butterfly lawn. Our third toolkit site was a 14-acre former cornfield at Bard College in Red Hook, New York. And the design essentially consists of a mix of upland meadow that was direct seeded with a no-till drill, a wet meadow that was also direct seeded, some scrub shrub wetland plantings, hedgerow, and hilltop plantings. And just an example of one of the areas on the site, we have pitch pine, beech plum, scrub oak, dwarf chestnut oak, 2 different species of low bush blueberry, and ragwort, as well as bee nesting strips. Bee nesting strips are essentially, you remove the top 4 inches of soil and vegetation in a sunny, well-draining, relatively dry area, and then you put back half the soil mixed with sand. And what that does is it makes the ideal environment for nesting, for ground nesting bees, including bumblebees. Lots of different plantings for lots of different types of environments, and some of the plants and the seed mixes. The last site, the conservation site, was a 200-acre site in Gallatin, New York. It consisted of about 100 acres of forest and wetlands and about 100 acres of open field. And we created a series of different designs that are sort of linking different areas of the landscape. This goes back to that diagram I showed you about the distance that native bees fly. So it's really important to have that habitat connectivity, even across a single property like this that's so large. And then, different example designs for those different areas, including the pond restoration area. So, we always also have best management practices for all of our projects, guidelines on how to prepare a site and seed a meadow directly from seed. A bit of a discussion about deer browse and how that's such a major factor in the success of native restoration projects. Right now, a very small portion of New York's existing forest is going to have a high level of regeneration based on current deer browse, and virtually no forest within the Hudson River estuary watershed has a secure or moderately high reliability for regeneration. That's all because of deer browse. This is just comparing here. I think this is kind of cool. So in 2010, the Nature Conservancy and the USDA did this map, and they had the predicted regeneration status for New York State on the left. You can see that quite a large portion is in green. And then in 2022, they updated it. You can see the difference here. That's all very closely associated with deer. Here's just a couple of different maps of the 4 watersheds. It's basically looking at which properties across these watersheds would be suitable for replication of the different toolkits. So for each toolkit, the map looks different because of the landscape differences, either land use or proximity to wetlands, what have you. And then here's a sort of, high priority sites for pollinator corridor expansion. So the idea is that with each of these 4 designs, landowners across this whole watershed can find something that works for them and put it on their own property and have all of the knowledge they need to do so. And currently, over 600 people have downloaded this from our website, and another 200 and something have ordered the printed book. Here's just some examples of the toolkit sites being implemented. This is the farmland site at Bard College being planted last fall. As I mentioned, they used a no-till wildflower seed drill that we recommended for the installation of the meadow. This is a Truax Flex 2. And this is all following the habitat management plan that we created for them. This is the YWCA in Kingston. And you can see the bottom corner is a rendering of what that little pocket garden will look like when it's fully grown in. Another project that we have, this is from Wellesley, Massachusetts. I'm sorry, from Egremont in the Berkshires. I just want to quickly mention that, okay, when we started in 2020, it was pretty much all grass. You can see here a picture. It was all installed by volunteers. Well, less than 3 seasons later, in 2023, this is what it looked like towards the middle of the summer. And we did a day where we trained people to use their phones and how to identify bumblebees on the site. And in an hour, we were able to observe 7 unique bumblebee species on this site. And what's important about that is that 2 of those species are target species for the project, species at risk of local extinction. When we started the project in 2020, there were just 2 bumblebee species on the site, and they were both common species. But now, less than 3 years later, we had 7 bumblebee species.
And I hate to interrupt because I have learned so much in this presentation
Yeah,
that
it's going on.
I'm very happy that Melissa reminded us to record, but I just wanted to check in for time if we can wrap up soon.
Yeah, I'm gonna skip the rest and just leave you guys with the link where you can download the Pollinate Now project. So if you go to our website, landscapeinteractions.com/pollinate now, it's available as a free PDF, or you can purchase a book at the cost of printing, which is $50, and it's a fully illustrated 200-page book. So either way, you'll have all the information I covered today there. We also have another link on our webpage called Projects, where you can download PDFs for free of other work that we've done in New England, specifically Massachusetts, as well as Connecticut.
Thank you.
That's about it for me.
Incredible.
I apologize for going a little over. I didn't really know what the time frame was, but I think I definitely hit that.
You did a wonderful job, and apologies if we didn't provide enough information there, but you did a wonderful job. And yeah, I learned a lot there. And I think I took really bad notes because I was very engrossed in all of the figures and images. And then I forgot and went to try and take some notes, so we can clean those up afterwards. But thank you. And I want to give folks time if anybody has specific questions while we have Evan. Amy, I don't know if you're trying to, yep.
Sorry, I was. I didn't click the button. I'm just curious about how many sites in Massachusetts you've worked on, and do your sites in Massachusetts include sort of this really in-depth level of detail that you went in for into for your New York sites?
Yeah, this project is just one example of the way that we kind of do everything. So we have at the moment, like in terms of installed projects, we have projects across the state. We've done work as far east as Martha's Vineyard and as far west as Egremont and other towns in Berkshire County like New Marlborough, Peru, up in the Highlands. We've got work everywhere. We've got work in most counties, sort of lacking in central, but we've done a lot of work with solar companies. So I was going to mention this a little bit, but in the interest of time, I skipped. Massachusetts used to have, or we really still have the best pollinator-friendly solar program in the country as far as certification. It's certified through UMass Amherst Clean Energy Extension. And the problem with the program is that it's no longer being funded with like sort of a credit. So back in 2020, when the program was launched, solar developers would actually receive $3,500 per megawatt per year for keeping their solar project certified pollinator friendly for the life of the project. And so we did about 30 different sites through that program in just like 2 years. It was sort of like an explosion. We were doing sites, down in Southeast, like Acushnet and like, Westport, Massachusetts, all the way up to like, Lunenburg and like Charlton and Worcester County. We were like over in Whately and Deerfield. We were up in Bernardston. We were over in, throughout Berkshire County, like the whole Berkshire County. And then they stopped the DPU, which is the Department of Public Utilities, decided we're going to stop what's called cost recovery, which is when ratepayers pay like a fraction of a cent for different vegetation management, which includes like, Eversource cutting down trees that are about to fall on the power lines. So we all pay for that, whether or not we're aware of it. Well, they had this program was funded through that, and they cut it. So ever since that funding was cut, the number of solar companies that are doing the work has really come down. And it's been unfortunate because I've seen some of our sites that were really nice get sort of like forgotten, and like they're not following the mowing schedule, or they're not following the invasive species management schedule. But some of them are still like good because we got in early enough that they had already kind of grown in. So I have like pictures and, you know, videos and stuff. Like some of these sites are just absolutely amazing, where it's like a sea of native grasses and flowers. So between that and like the sort of more customized work that we've done, like we've done pollinator plans in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which you can download, Great Barrington, and then we've done like site-specific design work in Wellesley, Egremont. We're working on a project with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Cape Cod, and some other projects like Hamden, East Longmeadow. We sort of have a pretty good coverage of the state, where we've kind of done like most types of projects, like in stormwater, you know, campuses, farms, large, small. So we have that. And, you know, if you're ever interested in visiting any of them or learning more, we could communicate about that.
Field trips.
Yeah,
I was gonna say
I was
that.
offering this, and it's still an option. I did offer over the winter that we could do a field trip. I think that the Egremont site would be a cool field trip because the vegetation is so well established. It's like a really good example of like, what do these plants actually look like? Like a lot of people don't know what they look like because it's so hard to find them in the wild. And the Egremont site's a good example of that. And it's also like basically in the wetland buffer of like a major forested wetland. We've also got the Wellesley site. Like if you want to see a site that's closer to like a more populated part of the state, our site in Wellesley is right next to the library, and I'm going to be leading a couple of different field trips there this summer, which potentially I could just let you guys know when that's happening, and you could just like send the invite out, or you could have your own like field trip there if you wanted to. We also are doing work with the Mashpee tribe this spring and this fall. In spring, we're doing site prep, and in fall, we're doing planting. And if anyone wants to volunteer, either helping with tarping or helping with weeding or with planting, that's going to be in collaboration with the tribe, and I would be happy to follow up with that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to remember to stop recording now.